Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. Buying the house on Elm Street was the single bravest thing I had ever done. It was a beautiful, slightly dilapidated Victorian, a 3-story testament to a bygone era of craftsmanship and character. It was far too much house for one person, my mother had said. But I saw it as a canvas. After years of living in sterile, box-like apartments, I craved a space with history, with quirks, with a soul. I wanted a home that felt like it had already lived a life before me. This house, with its creaking floors and dusty, forgotten corners, was perfect. The first few months were a whirlwind of blissful, exhausting work. I scraped away old wallpaper, patched plaster, and spent my weekends exploring antique shops for furniture that would suit the house's personality. Every project, no matter how small, felt like a profound act of ownership. I was not just a resident, I was a custodian, a partner in the house's slow journey back to its former glory. The sense of empowerment was intoxicating. I was building a life for myself, by myself. The house was full of secrets, but they were charming ones. I found an old newspaper from 1928, tucked under a loose floorboard in the attic. I discovered a small hidden pantry behind a false wall in the kitchen. These were the quirks I had craved, the small signs of the lives that had been lived here before. The house was not empty. It was filled with the quiet, benign ghosts of its own history, and I felt a strange sense of companionship in their presence. Of course, an old house comes with old house problems. The plumbing groaned, the windows rattled in the wind, and there were pests. Not a terrifying infestation, nothing like rats or cockroaches. My problem was much more subtle, more ancient. Silverfish. I would find them in the dark corners of the basement, in the back of my kitchen cupboards, their small, silvery bodies writhing away from the light. They were harmless, but they were a persistent, unwelcome presence. I tried the usual hardware store remedies: traps, sprays, diatomaceous earth. But the house was a labyrinth of nooks and crannies, of hidden voids and ancient walls. The silverfish always seemed to find a new path, a new corner to colonize. After a month of futile amateur warfare, I decided it was time to call in a professional. It felt like an admission of defeat, but also a responsible act of home ownership. I wanted the problem gone, for good. I found a company in the local phone book, a relic I'd found in a kitchen drawer. Hearth and Home Pest Solutions. The name sounded trustworthy, reliable. I called the number, and a polite professional woman scheduled an appointment for the following week. It was a simple, mundane transaction, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day in any city. It was the last normal, predictable event that would happen in my home for a very long time. The day of the appointment arrived, and with it, the technician. He was a tall, thin man, preternaturally quiet. He didn't have the cheerful, chatty demeanor of most service workers. He simply nodded when I explained the problem. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, scanning the room with an unnerving stillness. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was almost silent, his work boots making barely a sound on the old wooden floors. I showed him the areas where I had seen the silverfish: the kitchen, the bathrooms, the basement. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll need to do a full assessment," he whispered, his voice a dry, papery rustle. The source is often not where the problem appears. I'll need access to the basement and the attic as well. It seemed reasonable. Of course, he would need to see the whole house to understand the scope of the issue. I left him to his work, retreating to my home office to try and focus on a design project. But his quiet, intense presence in the house was a distraction. I could hear him moving around, but the sounds were minimal. There was none of the usual clatter and banging of a service technician. There was only a profound, almost reverent quiet, punctuated by the occasional soft creak of a floorboard. It was unsettling. He spent what felt like an unusually long time in the unseen spaces of the house. I could hear him moving around in the attic above me for nearly an hour. Then, he descended to the basement, and another long stretch of silence followed. I tried to dismiss my unease. He was a professional. He was being thorough. That was a good thing. That was what I was paying for. A thorough, quiet technician. When he finally emerged from the basement, he was covered in a fine layer of dust and cobwebs, which seemed to cling to his dark uniform. He held a large metal canister in one hand. "The assessment is complete," he whispered, his pale eyes not quite meeting mine. "The infestation is minor, but the house itself, it offers many points of entry, old foundations, gaps between the walls. It is a house with many hidden pathways." His description sounded less like a professional assessment and more like a strange, poetic observation. He explained that he had treated the perimeter, the basement, the attic, and what he called the voids, the dark, empty spaces between the floors and behind the walls. He assured me the chemicals were safe for humans after a few hours of airing out, and that my silverfish problem would be gone within a day. His explanation was professional, thorough, and yet it did nothing to quell the strange sense of unease I felt in his presence. He packed up his equipment in the same slow, silent, deliberate manner. Every movement was precise, economical, without a single wasted gesture. He was like a surgeon packing his tools after a long and difficult operation. I stood in the hallway, watching him, feeling like an intruder in my own home. His stillness was so profound that it made my own small, nervous movements feel loud and clumsy. As I walked him to the door, I tried to make some polite small talk to break the oppressive silence. "Well, I'm glad that's sorted," I said with a cheerfulness I did not feel. "It's an old house. I'm sure it's seen worse than a few silverfish." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and turned to look at me. For the first time, his pale blue eyes met mine directly, and I felt a genuine, involuntary shiver. "It is a house with a great deal of history," he whispered, his gaze seeming to look right through me, at the walls and the floors and the spaces behind them. Then he delivered the line that would come to haunt my every waking moment. "You have a lot of empty spaces in this house." He paused, as if searching for the right word, before finishing. "A lot of room. One must be careful what one allows to fill them." And then he was gone. He closed the door softly behind him, and I was left standing in my hallway, his strange final words echoing in the sudden silence. It was a bizarre, cryptic statement, the kind of thing a character in a Gothic novel might say. But he was just an exterminator, a quiet, odd man with a strange way of speaking. I shook my head, dismissing it as the harmless eccentricity of a man who spends his days in dark, forgotten spaces. The chemical smell from his treatment was sharp and acrid, but I welcomed it. It was the smell of a problem being solved. I opened the windows as he had instructed, and let the cold, fresh air cycle through the house. The unease he had caused began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of relief and satisfaction. The silverfish would be gone. The house would be truly mine again, free from any unwanted inhabitants. Over the next few days, I saw no sign of the pests. The technician, for all his strangeness, had been good at his job. The problem was solved. The house felt clean, secure. I began to forget about the quiet man and his unsettling parting words. He had been a brief, strange interlude in my otherwise happy journey of homeownership. My sanctuary was once again peaceful, my control over it absolute. I reveled in my pest-free home. I finished painting the guest room. I bought a new rug for the living room. I was nesting, putting my own unique stamp on the old house, filling its empty spaces with my own life, my own things. The house was slowly, surely, becoming a reflection of me. It was a place of safety, of comfort, of my own making. I had invited a stranger into my home, given him access to its most secret and forgotten corners, and he had solved my problem. That should have been the end of the story. But his parting, words lingered, a quiet, subconscious seed of dread. He had not just removed something from my home. The quiet technician, I would soon discover, had also left something behind. And it was far, far worse than a few silverfish. For 3 weeks, the house was perfect. The silence that had been broken by my unease about the quiet technician had settled back into a comfortable, peaceful quiet. The silverfish were completely gone. I searched my usual spots, the back of the cupboards, the dark corners of the basement, and found nothing but clean, empty space. The man had been strange, but he had been effective. I was a satisfied customer, and his cryptic parting words faded into a quirky, half-forgotten memory. I fully embraced my life as a homeowner. I planted a small herb garden in the kitchen window. I spent a weekend stripping and refinishing the beautiful, original banister on the main staircase. The house was responding to my care, its old bones seeming to sigh with a newfound sense of pride. I was in love with the space, with its history, with the future I was building within its walls. My sanctuary was complete. The house had its own language of sounds, a language I had come to know and love. The gentle groan of the floorboards as the temperature changed, the whistle of the wind through the old window frames, the rhythmic clanking of the radiators as they heated up in the evening. These were the sounds of a living, breathing home, and they were a comfort to me, a familiar symphony that accompanied my solitary life. It was in the 4th week that a new sound was added to the orchestra, and this one did not belong. I was in bed, reading, the house wrapped in the deep, profound silence of a weeknight. And I heard it, a faint, dry, scratching sound. It was coming from inside the wall next to my bed. It was a slow, deliberate sound, not the frantic, panicked scuttling of a mouse or a squirrel. It was a measured, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. My first thought was a simple one: pests. A mouse, or perhaps a raccoon, had somehow found its way into the walls. My heart sank with annoyance. After all the trouble and expense of hiring a professional, it seemed a new intruder had arrived. It was a common problem in old houses, especially ones that bordered a wooded area like mine did. It was a nuisance, but it was a normal, explainable one. I would have to call the company again. but the sound was wrong. I had heard mice before in previous apartments, and this was not the same. There was no frantic energy, no sense of panicked movement. This was a slow, patient, and methodical sound. It was the sound of something working, of something dragging a sharp object against the inside of my wall with a steady, unhurried rhythm. It was a sound that had an intelligence to it, a purpose. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster of the wall, listening intently. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was there, just on the other side of the wall, in the dark, empty void between the studs. The sound was so clear, so close, that I could almost visualize what was making it. A single long claw, dragging itself deliberately across the rough, aged wood of the house's interior frame. The image made my skin crawl. The sound continued for about 10 minutes, a steady, monotonous rhythm, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, tense. I lay in my bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the wall. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a very large, very strange squirrel perhaps, but the sound had felt too deliberate, too much like the sound of a tool being used, of a task being performed. The next night, it happened again. At the same time, just after midnight. The slow, methodical scratching from within the same wall. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was identical to the night before. The same rhythm, the same location, the same duration. This was not a random animal. This was a routine, just like my own routines. A new nocturnal inhabitant of my home was performing its own strange nightly ritual, and it lived inside my walls. My sense of peace was beginning to fracture again. The house, my safe and solid sanctuary, now had a secret, hidden activity happening within its very bones. The walls were no longer just barriers to the outside world. They were a container, and something was inside. Something that was patient, that was methodical, and that worked only in the dead of night, when the rest of the world was asleep. And it was getting started. I tried to dismiss it as the house's old bones. The temperature drops at night and the ancient wood contracts. That's all it was, a normal, explainable sound that my heightened senses, my solitude, were twisting into something sinister. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, a desperate prayer to the gods of logic and reason. But the sound was not the groan of contracting wood. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of something being deliberately dragged. The scratching became a fixed point in my nightly routine. I would get into bed, I would read my book, and I would wait. And just after midnight, it would begin. My unwanted, invisible roommate would start its strange, nightly work. I began to feel a bizarre, almost proprietary relationship with the sound. It was my secret, my torment, a private concert of horror performed just for me, from the other side of a thin layer of plaster. I thought about calling an animal control expert, but what would I tell them? I think I have a very slow, very patient squirrel living in my walls. I could imagine their laughter. Without more evidence, without seeing droppings or finding an entry point, my complaint was just the rambling of a paranoid homeowner. I felt trapped by the subtleness of the threat, my credibility a fragile shield against the world's skepticism. It was during the second week of the nightly scratching that my mind drifted back to the quiet technician, to his pale, watchful eyes, to his strange, disproportionate interest in the attic and the basement, and most of all, to his parting words. You have a lot of empty spaces in this house. The memory, which had faded into a quirky anecdote, now returned with a new and horrifying significance. It no longer sounded like an observation. It sounded like a statement of fact, a statement of discovery. Had he seen something in the walls during his assessment? A large animal? A structural problem? If so, why hadn't he told me? His job was to deal with pests, with unwanted inhabitants. A professional would have mentioned it, would have offered a solution. But he had said nothing. He had simply mentioned the empty spaces, the hidden pathways. The thought that he knew about this, that he had seen something and had chosen to remain silent, was deeply unsettling. His quietness, which I had first interpreted as simple eccentricity, now seemed like something else. It seemed like the quiet of a predator, of someone who moves with a deliberate stealth, who observes without being observed. He had moved through my home with an almost reverent silence, his presence a temporary disruption that had perhaps paved the way for this new, more permanent one. The thought was a cold dread coiling in my stomach. I was connecting dots that likely had no connection. I was letting my fear create a conspiracy out of a strange tradesman and a creaky old house. I told myself this repeatedly, but the connection felt too strong, too neat to be a coincidence. The pests were gone, yes. But his visit had been the dividing line between a normal life and the beginning of this new, inexplicable horror. He had taken one problem away and, perhaps, had left a much worse one in its place. I started to feel watched again, but not from the outside. The feeling came from within the house itself, from the walls around me. I would be cooking in the kitchen and would feel a sudden, intense prickling on my neck, a sense of being observed from the empty space behind the pantry. I would be reading in the living room and feel a gaze from the dark, hollow area beneath the floorboards. The house was no longer my sanctuary. It was a container, and I was trapped inside it with something else. The scratching was not just a sound anymore. It was a presence. It was a sign of an intelligence at work, an intelligence that lived in the dark, forgotten voids of my own home. My beautiful Victorian, with its charming nooks and crannies, now seemed like a labyrinth of secret passages, of hidden highways, for an entity I could not see. The empty spaces were no longer charming quirks. They were its territory. The fear was becoming a constant companion, a low-level hum of anxiety that underscored my every moment. The house was sick. It had a fever, a secret life that began when mine was supposed to be ending for the day. I knew, with a certainty that defied all my attempts at rationalization, that I could not live with the sound anymore. I had to find its source. I had to see what was inside my walls. The decision to investigate was a threshold crossed. I was no longer going to be a passive listener to my own home's secret torment. I spent the next day in a state of determined preparation, fueled by a mixture of terror and anger. If there was something in my walls, I would find it. Or, at the very least, I would find its source, the point where the sound was most concentrated. My house was a puzzle, and I was determined to solve it, no matter how horrifying the solution might be. My primary suspect was the wall in my bedroom, the epicenter of the nightly scratching. I started there. I tapped on the wall, listening for hollow spots. I pressed my ear against the plaster, trying to discern any acoustic variants. It was a futile effort. The entire house was old, filled with hollow spots and strange acoustics. I was an amateur, searching for a ghost with the blunt, instruments of my own limited knowledge. My investigation became more practical. The wall in question was shared with a deep, cavernous linen closet at the end of the upstairs hallway, a space I had barely touched since moving in. It was filled with old, musty blankets and yellowed sheets left by the previous owners. I reasoned that if there was an entry point for an animal, a loose board or a crack in the foundation, it might be visible from within the closet. I decided to empty it completely. The task was a dusty, unpleasant one. I pulled out armfuls of old linens, the scent of mothballs and decades of disuse filling the air. As I got deeper into the closet, I found piles of old newspapers from the 1980s, left to rot in the darkness. It was a time capsule of forgotten things, a space that had likely not been fully cleared out in over 40 years. It was the perfect place for a secret to fester, undisturbed. After clearing the last of the blankets, I was left with the bare wooden bones of the closet. I ran my hands along the walls, searching for drafts, for loose floorboards, for any sign of an opening to the outside world. I found nothing. The closet was solid, sealed. My theory of an animal intruder was beginning to look less and less likely. My frustration grew, mingled with the familiar cold tendrils of fear. I was about to give up, to close the door on the dusty, empty space, when my hand brushed against something soft in the far back corner, near the floor. I had assumed it was just a pile of loose insulation that had fallen from the attic above at some point. It was a common sight in old houses, but this felt different. It was not a random pile. It felt structured. My heart began to pound. With a sense of profound dread, I shone the light from my phone into the dark corner. It was not a pile of insulation. It was a nest. It was a small, perfectly constructed nest, about the size of a shoebox. It was woven together with a meticulous, almost artistic precision. The outer layer was made of shredded pink fiberglass insulation, the kind I knew was in my attic. The inside was lined with something softer. Carefully torn strips of the old, yellowed newspapers I had just found. I stared at the object, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This was not the work of a squirrel or a raccoon. Animals do not build with such perfect geometric form. They do not line their nests with carefully shredded strips of newspaper, as if for comfort. This was a deliberate construction. It was a product of an intelligence, of hands that knew how to weave and build. It was a man-made object, hidden in the darkest corner of my house. The fear I felt was so absolute, so pure, that it almost felt like a moment of perfect clarity. Every strange feeling, every rationalization, every moment of doubt, it all fell away, leaving only this one impossible truth. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been in this closet. And they had built this thing. This small, perfect, horrifying nest. The quiet technician's words echoed in my mind. Empty spaces. I knelt, my phone's light trembling, and looked closer. The craftsmanship was incredible. The insulation was not just piled, it was woven, its pink fibers interlaced to create a sturdy, bowl-like structure. The newspaper strips were arranged in a soft, concentric pattern on the inside, a bed for whatever was meant to sleep there. It was a grotesque parody of a bird's nest, a beautiful, terrible piece of folk art created by a madman. And it was in my house. I didn't touch it. I couldn't bring myself to. It felt like a sacred object, a totem of the person who had made it. and to disturb it felt like a profound and dangerous act. I just knelt there, in the dust and the dark, my phone's light the only thing illuminating this small, perfect horror. The scratching sound I had been hearing now had a purpose. It was the sound of construction, the sound of this nest being built. My mind, with a sickening, plunging certainty, went back to him, the quiet technician. He had been in my attic, where the pink insulation came from. He had been in my basement, where the old newspapers were stored. He had had access to every corner of my home. He had moved with an unnatural silence, and he had spoken of the empty spaces, the hidden pathways. This nest was his work. I was sure of it. The realization was a physical blow. A stranger, a man, I had paid to protect my home, had violated it in the most intimate way imaginable. He had not stolen anything. He had not broken anything. He had added something. He had built a secret, hidden piece of himself into the fabric of my house. The fear I felt was no longer about a sound. It was about a person who knew my home as well as I did, perhaps even better. I backed away from the closet slowly, as if a wild animal might suddenly leap out from the nest. I pulled the door shut, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud. I needed to hide what I had found, to pretend I had never seen it. To acknowledge its existence felt like acknowledging his continued presence, his victory. I piled the old blankets back in front of the door, hiding the secret once more in the clutter of the past, but I could not unsee it. The image of the nest was burned into my mind. My house was no longer my own. It was a shared space. I walked through the rooms, my eyes now seeing everything differently. Every closet, every dark corner, every space under the stairs. They were no longer just parts of my home. They were potential hiding places, potential locations for another meticulously crafted nest. The house was full of his secrets. The scratching sound, which I had previously found merely unsettling, was now a source of profound terror. It was not the sound of an animal. It was the sound of him. Was he in the walls right now? Was he working on a new nest? Or was he simply listening, his ear pressed to the other side of the plaster, just as I had done, listening to me, to my breathing, to the beating of my terrified heart? My sense of safety was completely gone, replaced by a constant gnawing paranoia. I was living in a house with a secret roommate, a roommate who lived in the walls and built nests out of insulation and trash. The sheer, bizarre nature of the violation was what made it so terrifying. It was not a normal crime. It was a piece of surreal, intimate horror that I could never explain to anyone. Who would ever believe me? I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to pack a bag and run, to never return to this house. But a stubborn, angry part of me refused. This was my house. I had poured my sweat, my savings, my dreams into this place. I would not be driven from it by a quiet, strange man and his pathological need to build nests in the dark. I would not surrender my home to him. This was my territory, and I would fight for it. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my living room, every light in the house blazing, a heavy kitchen knife on the table beside me. I was waiting. I was listening for the scratching to begin. But the house was silent. It was as if he knew he had been discovered, as if he knew I had found his secret work. And the silence was, in its own way, more menacing than the sound had been. It was the silence of a predator that knows it has been seen. The first act of my haunting was over. The subtle sounds, the growing unease, had culminated in this single, undeniable discovery. The threat was real, it was human, and it had made a home within my home. My denial was shattered, my rationalizations a pile of dust. I was no longer dealing with a strange sound. I was dealing with the quiet technician, and I had no idea what his game was, or what his next move would be. The silence that followed my discovery of the nest was a living, breathing thing. It was a silence filled with knowledge, with the shared secret that now existed between me and the man who haunted my walls. He knew I had found his work, and I knew that he knew. The nightly scratching had stopped, but its absence was not a relief. It was a pause, a breath held in a game whose rules I did not understand. My home was a chessboard, and my opponent had just let me see one of his hidden pieces. For 3 days, the house remained quiet. I moved through it like a ghost myself, my senses on a razor's edge. I would leave rooms and then double back, checking to see if anything had been moved. I would leave tiny, nearly invisible threads taped across closet doors, only to find them, unbroken hours later. He was patient, or he was gone. I didn't know which possibility was more terrifying. The waiting, the not knowing, was a slow, grinding form of torture. I tried to live normally. I went to work, I bought groceries, I talked to my friends on the phone, but it was all a performance. The real me was back in the house, constantly listening, constantly watching. The image of the nest was always there, at the back of my mind, a perfect woven thing made of my own home's guts. A grotesque piece of art that served as a constant reminder of my profound, intimate violation. On the 4th day, I was getting ready for work. A simple, mundane morning routine that now felt fraught with tension. I went to my jewelry box, a small antique wooden case that sat on my dresser, to get the silver locket I wore every day. It had been my grandmother's, a small, simple oval with a delicate floral engraving. It was the most precious thing I owned. I opened the box. The small, velvet-lined space where the locket always rested was empty. My heart seized. It was gone. I frantically searched the box, my fingers scrabbling through my other necklaces and earrings. It wasn't there. I checked the top of the dresser, the floor around it, my bedside table. The locket had simply vanished. My first thought was a practical one. I must have misplaced it. I must have taken it off somewhere else in the house and forgotten where I had put it. I tried to remain calm, to be logical. I spent the next hour searching the house, my initial calm logic slowly dissolving into a frantic, rising panic. I checked the bathroom counters, the pockets of my coats, the small dish by the kitchen sink where I sometimes put my rings. It was nowhere. The locket was a part of me. I had worn it nearly every day for 10 years. I did not lose it. I did not misplace it. The routine of taking it off at night and putting it on in the morning was pure muscle memory. Then, the cold, horrifying thought began to creep in. He had been in my house, not just in the walls, not just in the attic and the basement. He had been in my bedroom. He had stood here at my dresser. He had opened my jewelry box, and he had taken the one item that meant more to me than anything else. The thought was so violating it made me feel physically sick. He had touched my most precious personal things. This was a horrifying escalation. The nests were bizarre, a strange, almost impersonal form of intrusion. But this was different. This was theft. And it was not a theft of value, but of sentiment. He had chosen the one piece of jewelry that was irreplaceable, the one with the deepest emotional connection. He was not just a trespasser anymore. He was a student of my life, a man who was systematically learning what was important to me. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I just sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the empty space in my jewelry box. The house felt profoundly unsafe, a place where my most cherished memories could be plucked away by an unseen hand. The silence from the walls was no longer just a pause in the game. It was the silence of a predator who has already taken its prize and is now just watching its victim suffer. I had to find it. The obsessive need to recover the locket overrode even my fear. It was a piece of my grandmother, a piece of my past, and he had no right to it. I didn't know where to start. The house was so big, so full of his empty spaces, but I knew I had to look. I had to go into the dark, forgotten corners of my own home and search for the thing he had stolen. And I was terrified of what else I might find there. My search started with a frantic, systematic tearing apart of my own living space. I emptied every drawer, checked under every piece of furniture, sifted through every pocket of every piece of clothing in my closet. A part of my mind, the logical part, was still clinging to the hope that I had simply been careless, that the locket would turn up in some mundane, ordinary place. But the other part of me, the part that now knew the truth of this house, knew I wouldn't find it here. The search was fruitless. The locket was not in my bedroom, not in my living room, not in my kitchen. It was gone from the spaces that I inhabited. That left only the other spaces, the dark, forgotten spaces, the spaces that he had spent so much time in, the attic and the basement. A cold dread washed over me. I knew, with a certainty that felt like a premonition, that I would find my locket in one of those places. I decided to start with the basement. The attic felt too high, too close to the sky. The basement was a descent into the dark, earthy foundations of the house, a place of dampness and shadows. I grabbed a powerful flashlight from the kitchen drawer, its heavy metal body a small comfort, in my hand, and I opened the door that led down into the darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and smelled of damp earth and something else. Something vaguely like decaying paper. The basement stairs creaked under my feet, each step a descent into my own fear. The space was large, unfinished, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. A single bare bulb hung from a wire in the center, casting a weak yellow light that did little to dispel the deep, oppressive shadows that clung to the corners of the room. It was a labyrinth of old furniture, discarded boxes, and the skeletal remains of past lives. I moved through the space slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I was scanning the corners, the dark spaces behind the old furnace, the gaps between the forgotten junk. I was looking for another nest. I knew that's where it would be. He wouldn't just take the locket. He would use it. He would incorporate it into his strange, terrible art. He would make it a part of his world. And then I saw it. In the farthest, darkest corner of the basement, behind an old, broken-down washing machine, was another one of his creations. It was larger than the first one, more robust. It was a tightly woven basket of shredded insulation and what looked like old rotted canvas, and nestled in its center, on a bed of carefully arranged newspaper strips, was a small, familiar glint of silver. I knelt before the nest, my flashlight beam trembling. It was my locket, my grandmother's locket. It was lying perfectly in the center of the grotesque, man-made nest, its delicate silver chain coiled around it. It looked like an offering on a dark altar. He had taken the most precious piece of my history, my love, my memory, and he had made it the centerpiece of his own secret, pathological world. The violation was absolute. This was not a simple theft. This was a desecration. He had not stolen the locket to sell it. He had stolen it to possess it, to integrate it into his own strange ritual. He was building a new life, a new world, within the walls and forgotten spaces of my home, and he was using the pieces of my own life as his building materials. My past was now a part of his present. I reached out a shaking hand and snatched the locket from the nest. The silver was cold against my skin. I backed away, my eyes still fixed on the nest, a horrifying monument to his intrusion. I felt a sense of profound and utter despair. He had been in my room, he had touched my things, he had stolen my most precious memory, and he had brought it down here, into the darkness, to make it his own. I ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door, locking it behind me as if that could somehow contain the horror, but I knew it was useless. The first part of my nightmare was over. The subtle hints had given way to undeniable proof. The threat was real. It was human, and it was intimately familiar with every aspect of my life. And I was trapped in this house with him, a man who built nests and stole memories and whose face I had never even seen. I clutched the silver locket in my hand, its familiar weight a cold, hard anchor in the swirling chaos of my fear. Back in the relative safety of my living room, I stared at the nest I had left behind in the basement, not with my eyes, but with my mind. It was an image that would be permanently etched there. The nest in the closet had been a sign of his presence. This nest, the one that had held my locket, was a declaration of his intimacy with my life. He hadn't just been in my house. He had been through my memories. The rage returned. A clean, sharp, and focused anger that burned away the edges of my paralyzing fear. This was my home. These were my memories. I would not be a passive curator of his grotesque, secret museum. I would not let him continue to nest in the dark corners of my life. I had to fight back. I had to find him. And my only connection to him, my only lead, was the company he had worked for. Hearth and Home Pest Solutions. I scrambled through the papers on my desk, my hands searching for the invoice he had left me weeks ago. I found it tucked away in a folder labeled House Maintenance. The company name was printed at the top in a cheerful, friendly font, a horrifying contrast to the silent, gaunt man who had been its representative. And at the bottom of the page, there was a phone number. My heart pounded with a surge of adrenaline. This was it. A direct link. I grabbed my phone, my fingers punching in the numbers with a determined urgency. I was going to demand answers. I was going to describe their technician, his strange behavior, the things I had found. I was going to report him, to have him fired, to have his name, to give it to the police. The phone began to ring, and I held my breath, rehearsing the angry, accusatory speech I was about to deliver. But I never got the chance. After a single ring, the call was interrupted by a recorded message. A cold, robotic female voice spoke into my ear. "We're sorry," the voice said, devoid of any sympathy. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Please check the number and try your call again." I stared at my phone in disbelief. Disconnected. I tried the number again. The same recorded message. It was a dead end. A complete and total dead end. The company, my only link to the quiet technician, had vanished. It was as if it had never existed. The realization was a new cold wave of dread. Was it a fake company? A front? Had he created this entire elaborate facade just to gain access to my home? The level of premeditation, of planning, was staggering. I was not just a random target of opportunity. I had been chosen. This new knowledge shifted my fear into a new, more practical gear. I could no longer hunt for him. He had covered his tracks too well. All I could do was defend against him. If I couldn't find him out there, I would have to make it impossible for him to get back in here. My home, my beautiful Victorian canvas, was about to become a fortress, a prison of my own making, designed to keep the monster out. That afternoon, I went to the hardware store, my mind a checklist of security measures. I bought new, heavy-duty deadbolts for every exterior door. I bought window locks for every single window, even the small, inaccessible ones on the third floor. I bought a set of motion-activated security cameras, the kind that would send an alert directly to my phone if they detected any movement. I was building a wall of technology and steel around myself. I spent the entire weekend installing my new defenses. I was no longer a writer or a homeowner restoring a beautiful old house. I was a security consultant, a paranoid survivalist. Every turn of the screwdriver, every new lock I installed, felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of my own space. I was patching the holes, sealing the cracks, trying to make my home an impenetrable fortress. I was fighting back with brass and steel. By Sunday night, the house was transformed. The old, charming locks had been replaced by gleaming, modern deadbolts. The windows were secured. The cameras were positioned, their small red lights a series of watchful, electronic eyes guarding my perimeter. I sat in my living room, watching the live feeds on my phone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a fragile, tentative sense of safety. I had built a new wall against the darkness. I became the warden of my own home. My phone was a constant companion, the security camera app always open. I watched the feeds with an obsessive focus. The view of my empty front porch, the still silence of my backyard, the motionless street out front. Every flicker of a leaf, every passing car, was a potential threat that I analyzed and then dismissed. I was living in a state of high alert, but it was a state of my own choosing, my own control. For 3 days, the cameras showed nothing but the mundane passage of time. The mailman came and went. A neighbor walked their dog. The world outside my fortress continued on its normal, predictable path. And inside, the house was silent. There was no scratching from the walls. There were no new discoveries in the dark corners of my closets or my basement. The silence was a welcome, reassuring balm. Slowly, cautiously, my terror began to recede. It seemed my defenses had worked. The new locks, the cameras, they had been a deterrent. Perhaps he was just an opportunist, a strange man who took advantage of old, unsecured houses. And now that my house was a fortress, he had moved on to find an easier, more vulnerable target. The thought brought a surge of profound, guilt-ridden relief. I was safe, perhaps at someone else's expense. By the end of the week, I was beginning to feel like myself again. I was sleeping through the night. I was focusing on my work. I still checked the cameras frequently, but it was becoming more of a habit than an obsession. The constant gnawing fear was being replaced by a sense of hard-won security. I had been Violated, yes, but I had fought back, and I had successfully reclaimed my space. I even ventured back down into the basement. I cleaned out the horrifying nest, sweeping away the last remnants of his violation with a grim satisfaction. I did the same to the nest in the upstairs closet. I was cleansing my house of his presence, erasing the memory of his strange, terrible art. With every bag of trash I took out, I felt lighter, more in control. The house was mine again, and I was evicting its ghost. My pride in my own resilience was immense. I had faced a terrifying, inexplicable threat, and I had met it with practical, logical solutions. I had not been driven out. I had not crumbled. I had fortified. I had watched, and I had won. The house was no longer a place of fear. It was a testament to my own strength, its new locks and cameras symbols of my refusal to be a victim. This feeling of victory, however, was a dangerous illusion. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of false assumptions. I had assumed that the threat came from the outside. I had assumed that locks and cameras were a meaningful defense. I had treated the problem like a simple home invasion, a matter of physical security. I had failed to understand the true nature of the quiet technician's trespass. He was not interested in bypassing my new deadbolts. He was not afraid of my cameras. My defenses were a joke to him, a child's wall made of building blocks. He had no need to break in through a door or a window. He had no need to ever appear on one of my carefully placed cameras. My entire fortress was designed to defend against an enemy who was already inside. He had let me have my week of peace. He had let me install my locks, my cameras. He had watched me cleanse my house of his nests. He had given me just enough time to feel safe, to believe I had won, to lower my guard completely. He was patient. And he was about to show me just how useless my defenses were, and just how deeply he was already embedded in my life. Because his goal was not to get into my house. He was already in. His goal was to show me that he knew me, and his next gift, his next message, would not be something I found in a dusty, forgotten corner. It would be a direct, personal, and devastating proof that he had not just been in my closets and my basement. He had been through my most cherished memories. My newfound sense of security was a fragile shield, but for a week it held. I began to move through my house with a renewed confidence. The cameras, which I initially checked with obsessive frequency, became a background comfort. They showed nothing but empty rooms and the peaceful passage of daylight into dusk. The silence from within the walls was complete. I had scoured the basement and closets, and they had remained clean, empty, and blessedly free of any new nests. I had won. I started to feel foolish about my extreme reaction. The technician had been a strange man, certainly, and the nests were a bizarre, unsettling mystery. But perhaps that's all they were. A strange man's strange parting gesture. He had done his work and moved on, and my subsequent fear had been an overreaction, my mind connecting dots that weren't there. The silence was proof that I was safe, now. The fortress I had built was working, and I could finally, truly relax in my own home. It was a Saturday afternoon when the illusion was shattered. I needed to retrieve a box of old winter clothes from the basement, a mundane task I had been putting off. I unlocked the heavy new deadbolt I had installed on the basement door, a satisfyingly solid and secure sound. With my security cameras and my new locks, I had no reason to feel any apprehension. The basement was just a basement again, a place for storage, not a place of horror. I descended the creaking wooden stairs, flicking on the single bare bulb that illuminated the space. The air was cool and damp, the familiar smell of earth and stone. I had cleaned the space meticulously after finding the nest with my locket, and it was still clean, still empty, still quiet. I navigated through the clutter to the back corner, where my storage boxes were stacked, feeling completely at ease, my guard completely down. And there, in the exact same spot where I had found the last one, was a new nest. My breath caught in my throat, a sudden, sharp intake of frigid air. It was impossible. I had been checking the camera that covered the basement stairs daily. No one had come in or out of this room. And yet, here it was. A new construction, larger than the last, woven with the same meticulous, obsessive care from shredded insulation and strips of something that looked like old canvas. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. My fortress was a sham. My locks, my cameras, they were meaningless. He had gotten in. He had come back down into my basement, into the darkest corner of my house, and had built this new, horrifying monument to his presence, without triggering a single alarm, without leaving a single trace of his entry. He was a ghost who could walk through my walls and bypass my technology with ease. This nest was different. It was more intricate, more solid. It was a more confident piece of work. It was as if he were honing his craft, perfecting his terrible, unique art form. And in the center of the nest, where my silver locket had been, there was a new object. It was small, made of wood, and carved with a clumsy, almost childish precision. It was a doll, a small, simple wooden peg doll. I crept closer, my flashlight beam trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs. The doll was about 3 inches, tall, carved from a single piece of pale, unfinished pine. It had a simple round head, a cylindrical body, and 2 small outstretched arms. It was crudely made, yet there was a strange, familiar quality to its shape, to the specific way its arms were positioned. A cold, forgotten memory began to stir in the back of my mind. I knew this doll. The realization was a slow, dawning horror. It was a perfect miniature replica of a doll my grandmother had given me when I was a child. It was a one-of-a-kind toy that my grandfather had carved for her. I hadn't seen the original in over 20 years. It was packed away in a box of my childhood things in the attic. There was no photograph of it, no digital record. It existed only in my memory and in a dusty box in the highest, most inaccessible part of my house. He had been in my attic. He had gone through my boxes. He had opened my sealed containers of childhood memories. He had found the doll my grandfather had carved, an object imbued with all the love and nostalgia of my past. And he had studied it. He had studied it so closely that he was able to recreate it, perfectly, in miniature. This was not just a violation of my home. This was a violation of my life, of my history, of my very soul. I stood there in the damp, musty air of my basement, the small wooden doll feeling impossibly heavy in my palm. This was not a random act of intimidation. This was a message of profound, terrifying intimacy. He had not just walked through my home. He had sifted through my past. He had found a piece of my most cherished, most private history, and he had held it in his hands. The thought of his strange, silent presence in my attic, surrounded by the ghosts of my childhood, was a violation so deep it left me breathless. The meticulousness of his work was what truly terrified me. This was not a quick, opportunistic act. To find the doll, he would have had to go into the attic, locate the specific box I had labeled childhood keepsakes, open the sealed container, and find the doll among dozens of other forgotten treasures. Then, he would have had to study it, to memorize its every clumsy, hand-carved detail before creating this perfect miniature replica. The time, the patience, the obsession required was monstrous. I ran from the basement, my feet pounding up the stairs, my mind a blur of panic. I had to know. I had to see the original. I pulled down the folding ladder to the attic, the movement stiff and loud in the silent house. I scrambled up into the hot, stuffy darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick, swirling dust, motes. I found the stack of storage containers, my heart pounding in my chest as I located the one labeled keepsakes. The container was sealed with heavy packing tape, just as I had left it years ago. But as I looked closer, I could see that the tape had been carefully slid open along one edge and then pressed back down. It was a subtle, almost invisible wound, but it was there. Someone had been inside this box. With trembling hands, I ripped the tape off and opened the lid. I dug through layers of old report cards and faded photographs until my fingers closed around the familiar shape of the original doll. It was still there, safe in its plastic tomb. But holding it now, it felt contaminated, tainted by his knowledge of it. I sat there, on the dusty floor of my attic, with the original doll in one hand and his tiny, perfect replica in the other. They were a horrifying match set, a testament to his reach, to his power. He was showing me that nothing was safe from him, not even my most deeply buried memories. My fortress had been a child's fantasy. My locks, my cameras, my steel deadbolts, they were all useless against a man who could move through the unseen spaces of my home, who could access my most private, sealed-away possessions without leaving a trace. He was not breaking in. He was simply there. He was a part of the house now, a secret, cancerous growth living within its very bones. The scratching sound I had been hearing now made a new, more terrible kind of sense. It was not just the sound of nest building. It was the sound of his work, the slow, patient scraping of a knife on a small piece of wood, the sound of him carving my memories into new, terrifying shapes. He was a craftsman, and his workshop was the hollow space inside my walls, his materials the fabric of my own life. I now understood the true nature of the game. He was not trying to scare me out of the house. He was trying to colonize it, to merge his presence with my own. The nests, the locket, the doll, they were his attempts to build a world that was a twisted reflection of mine. He was not just an intruder. He was a shadow self, a dark, silent twin who was rebuilding my life in his own horrifying image. My sense of isolation was absolute. How could I ever explain this to anyone? Who would believe a story of a magical wall-walking exterminator who carves replicas of your childhood toys? I was the sole witness to a crime so bizarre, so personal, that it defied all rational belief. My sanity was the only ground I had left to stand on, and it was crumbling beneath my feet. I climbed down from the attic, leaving the open box of my childhood behind. The house was no longer my own. It was a shared space, a collaboration between myself and the quiet technician. He had his spaces, the dark voids between the walls, and I had mine. But the line between them was becoming thinner every day, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was about to show me just how thin that line truly was. The discovery of the doll broke something deep inside me. The previous horrors had been frightening, but this was different. This was an act of profound, psychological intimacy. He had not just invaded my space, he had invaded my past. He had held a piece of my childhood in his hands and had replicated it with a terrifying, obsessive care. The quiet technician was not just a squatter. He was an archaeologist of my life, and I was his unwilling, terrified subject. I knew I could not live like this, a prisoner in a house that was actively being colonized by a silent, unseen madman. My attempts at physical security had been a joke. My only hope, as slim as it was to try and make someone believe me. I needed an ally, a witness, someone from the outside world to look at my evidence and confirm that I was not losing my mind. I decided to call my older brother, Mark. He was a lawyer, a man of logic and evidence, and he had always been my protector. I invited him over for dinner, pretending that everything was normal. I couldn't tell him the story over the phone. He needed to be here, in the space, to see the evidence with his own eyes. The performance was excruciating. I made small talk. I asked about his work. All the while, the knowledge of the nests and the doll was a screaming presence in my mind. He could tell something was wrong. He kept asking me if I was okay, if I was enjoying the new house. After dinner, I finally broke. My composure crumbled, and the whole terrified story came spilling out of me. I told him everything. The quiet technician, the disconnected number, the scratching in the walls. I took him to the upstairs closet and showed him the first nest. He stared at it, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "It's probably just some weird insulation thing, Alice," he said, trying to find a logical explanation. "No," I insisted, my voice trembling. "Look at it. It's woven. It's deliberate." I then led him down to the basement, my heart pounding with every step. I showed him the second, larger nest, the one that had held my locket. His lawyerly skepticism was beginning to show cracks. He knelt, examining the construction, his brow furrowed in a deep, worried frown. He had to admit it was strange, incredibly strange. But it was the final piece of evidence that I knew would be the real test. I took a deep breath and showed him the small wooden doll. "This was in the center of that nest," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark, this is a perfect copy of a doll Grandma gave me, one that's been in a sealed box in the attic for 20 years. I watched his face, praying for a look of horror, of belief, of validation. He took the doll, turning it over in his practical, steady hands. He looked at me, and his expression was not one of belief. It was one of profound, heartbreaking pity. "Alice," he said softly, his voice full of a gentle, worried concern that was worse than any disbelief. "Are you feeling okay? I mean, really okay? This house is a big project. You're here all alone. Maybe the stress is getting to you a little bit." I stared at him, my last hope crumbling. "Mark, listen to me," I pleaded. "He must have gone through my things in the attic. He found the original and copied it." He just shook his head slowly. "Or," he offered gently, "you found an old doll in the basement that just happens to look like one you remember from when you were a little kid. Memories are tricky things, Alice. They're not as reliable as we think they are." He was trying to protect me, not from an intruder, but from myself. In his logical lawyer's mind, the possibility of a secret, wall-walking exterminator who carves replicas of childhood toys was so remote so insane that the only plausible explanation was that his sister was having a breakdown. The story was too fantastical to be true, so the storyteller must be unwell. My evidence was being dismissed as a symptom of my own psychological distress. I tried to argue, to show him the slit in the tape on the storage box in the attic, but he wouldn't look. He didn't want to see any more evidence. He had already reached his verdict. His priority was no longer my safety from an outside threat, but my own mental well-being. He spent the rest of the evening trying to convince me to see a therapist, to take a break from the house, to come and stay with him and his family for a while. He left that night with a hug that felt more like a clinical assessment than a gesture of familial love. He promised to call me every day to check in. I knew what that meant. It meant he was monitoring me, waiting for me to slip further into the madness he was now convinced had taken root in my mind. The protector of my childhood had become the gentle, worried warden of my perceived breakdown. The door closing behind him was the sound of my last hope being extinguished. I was completely and utterly alone. The one person I thought would stand by me, would believe me no matter what, had looked at my proof and had seen only a reflection of his own fears for my sanity. His disbelief was a heavier blow than any of the technician's strange gifts. The technician was a monster, but my brother's reaction made me feel, for the first time, like I might actually be the one who was monstrously wrong. The thought of calling the police now seemed laughable. If my own brother, presented with the physical evidence, had concluded I was delusional, what would a cynical, overworked police officer think? I could hear the conversation in my head. A woman, living alone in a big, spooky house, complaining about nests made of trash and a doll she thought she remembered from her childhood. They wouldn't send an officer. They would send a paramedic. My tormentor had created the perfect crime. A crime with no witnesses, no discernible motive, and evidence, so bizarre and so personal that it served only to discredit the victim. He had weaponized disbelief. He had made my reality so strange that the sane world could not help but reject it. I was trapped in a nightmare, and everyone I tried to tell simply thought I was the one dreaming. His silence, his elusiveness, was his greatest strength. He never showed his face. He never made a direct threat. He just left his quiet, strange, and deeply personal art in the dark corners of my house. He was a ghost whose only fingerprints were the ones he left on my psyche, and that kind of evidence would never stand up in any court, be it legal or the court of a loved one's opinion. I now understood the true nature of my isolation. It was not just physical, a matter of living alone in a large house. It was epistemological. My reality was no longer a shared one. It had been severed from the consensus reality of everyone else. I was the sole inhabitant of a small, terrifying island of truth, and everyone else was on a mainland I could no longer reach, waving at me with concern, convinced I was drowning in my own delusions. I stopped trying to find help. I stopped talking about it. I retreated into myself, into the quiet, constant hum of my own fear. The house was a battleground, and the war was a silent one, waged between myself and the quiet technician. He would leave his nests, his sculptures, his stolen and replicated memories, and I would find them. It was a horrifying, intimate, and completely private relationship. The days that followed were lived in a state of suspended animation. I went to work, I ate, I slept. But none of it felt real. The only real thing was the house, the walls, and the certain knowledge that I was not alone within them. The scratching sound returned some nights, and I would just lie there and listen, no longer with terror, but with a kind of weary, resigned familiarity. It was the sound of my roommate, working on his next project. I was being slowly, methodically broken. My connection to the outside world, to the shared reality of others, had been severed. My own mind was becoming an echo chamber of fear and doubt. The technician had not just invaded my home, he had invaded my sanity, making me question the very evidence of my own senses. This was his true victory. He had made me as isolated and as quiet as he was. But he wasn't finished. His campaign of terror was about to enter its final, most audacious phase. He had explored my past, nested in my hidden spaces, and severed my connection to the world. Now, he was about to prove that the walls between us were not just thin, they were imaginary. He was about to come out of the empty spaces and walk in, my own. The quiet tenant was about to make his presence known. My brother's visit was the last time I tried to explain my situation to anyone. His loving, pitying disbelief was more isolating than any stranger's scorn could have been. I was officially on my own, the sole inhabitant of my own strange reality. I stopped looking for answers or for help. My life became a quiet, tense waiting game, a cold war waged against an invisible enemy who lived in the empty spaces of my home. I simply endured, waiting for his next move. The days that followed were filled with a heavy, oppressive silence. The nightly scratching stopped completely. No new nests appeared. No more sentimental objects were stolen and returned as grotesque works of art. This silence was not a comfort. It was a threat. It was the quiet of a predator that knows it has successfully cornered its prey. He was giving me time to fully appreciate my isolation, to let the hopelessness sink deep into my bones. I tried to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. I went to work. I bought groceries. I pretended that I was not living in a house with a secret, silent occupant. But it was a hollow performance. My home was no longer a place of comfort. It was a shared territory, and the silence was just a sign that my roommate was being quiet. Every creak of the old house, every groan of the pipes, was a potential sign of his movement. I became an expert in the sounds of my own home. I could distinguish the sound of the wind rattling a window frame from the sound of the house settling. I knew the specific clank of the radiator in the hallway. I had memorized the entire symphony of my house's normal, natural noises. I did this so that I would immediately recognize any sound that was out of place, any sound that did not belong, any sound that was him. One evening, about a week after my brother's visit, I was in the living room, trying to lose myself in a movie. The television was on, the volume turned up just loud enough to create a comforting blanket of noise. It was a cold, quiet night. The house was still, wrapped in the deep silence of the suburbs. I was almost beginning to feel relaxed, a dangerous and foolish indulgence I had not allowed myself in a long time. And then I heard it. It was a sound from directly above me, from the empty guest bedroom. It was not the familiar, dry scratching from within the walls. This was a different sound. It was a single, distinct, and undeniable creak. It was not the long, groaning sound of the house settling. It was the short, sharp, and localized sound of a single floorboard, responding to a sudden applied weight. I froze, the remote control slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I muted the television, and the sudden silence was absolute, profound. I strained my ears, listening, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. Had I imagined it? Was it just the house, and my own frayed nerves twisting it into something more? I sat there, motionless, for a long, silent minute, listening. It was the sound of a footstep. I knew it with a certainty that was as absolute and as terrifying as the discovery of the nest. It was the sound a person makes when they are trying to move quietly, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. The scratching had been in the walls, in his world. This sound was in my world. It was in one of the main rooms of my house, a room that was supposed to be completely empty. He was no longer content to live in the empty spaces. He had come out. He was now walking in the rooms of my home, just a few feet above my head. But that thin barrier of the ceiling was all that separated us. The thought was so horrifying that I could not breathe. My carefully constructed fortress, my locks and my cameras, were a joke. He had an entrance into my home that did not involve a door or a window. I sat on my couch, paralyzed by a new and more immediate kind of terror. Before, he had been a ghost, a presence in the hidden voids. Now he was a physical intruder. He was upstairs, in my guest room, moving through my space with a quiet, confident familiarity. The game had changed. He was no longer just leaving me gifts and messages. He was now a physical presence, sharing my home in the most direct and terrifying way possible. I remained on the couch, a statue carved from fear, my ears straining to catch another sound, any sound, that would either confirm or deny what I had just heard. The normal ambient noises of the house, which I had so meticulously catalogued, were gone. My entire world, my entire consciousness, had narrowed to the ceiling above my head. I was listening to the silence, praying for it to remain unbroken, yet knowing, with a sick certainty, that it would not. And then it came. Another creak. And another. It was a slow, deliberate procession of footsteps, moving from the center of the guest room towards the hallway. Each step was carefully placed, the sound of an immense, patient weight being shifted from one foot to the other. He was walking. He was taking a leisurely, confident stroll through the upstairs of my home, as if he were the lord of the manor inspecting his domain. My meticulously installed security system was a complete and utter failure. The cameras watched the outside, the doors, the windows. They were designed to stop an intruder from getting in. They were useless against an intruder who was already in, an intruder who had his own private, hidden doorways that bypassed my entire network of defense. My fortress had been built with a massive, fatal blind spot, the inside. I was trapped. I couldn't run out the front door. He was upstairs. He would hear me. I couldn't go upstairs to confront him. The thought was paralyzing, a suicidal act of folly. I couldn't even call the police. What would I say? I think I heard a footstep? After my brother's reaction, I knew how that call would end. I was completely, utterly, and hopelessly on my own, a prisoner on the ground floor of my own home. The footsteps stopped at the top of the main staircase. I could pinpoint his location in my mind, a terrifying three-dimensional awareness of his presence. He was standing there, just at the edge of the upstairs landing, looking down into the darkened living room where I sat. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his gaze, a heavy, palpable weight in the air. He was watching me, listening to me, just as I was listening to him. This was the culmination of his game. He had nested in my walls. He had stolen my memories. He had isolated me from the world. And now he had revealed himself, not with a whisper or a gift, but with the simple, undeniable, and profoundly terrifying sound of his own 2 feet on my floorboards. He was showing me that the barrier between his world and mine was gone. We were now roommates. The silence stretched on for an eternity. I sat on my couch, my body rigid, my breath a shallow, hitching thing in my chest. He just stood there, at the top of the stairs, in the darkness, waiting, watching. What was he waiting for? For me to scream? For me to run? For me to acknowledge him? The not knowing was a unique and exquisite form of torture. The psychological game had entered its final, most terrifying phase. And then I heard one final sound. The slow, soft creak of him turning and walking away, his footsteps retreating back into the guest room. A few moments later, there was silence. A complete, absolute, and final silence. He had made his point. He had shown me that he could walk through my house at will, and now he had retreated, back into the walls, back into his own secret, hollow world, leaving me alone with the horrifying knowledge of what he was capable of. The second act of my nightmare was over. The game of psychological warfare, of nests and dolls, had been won. He had proven his absolute control over my environment, my life, my sanity. There were no more defenses to build. There was no one left to call. The distinction between his space and my space was now meaningless. The entire house was his, and I was just a frightened, trembling tenant who was allowed to live in it. I sat there, in the dark, for the rest of the night, long after the television screen had faded to black. The despair was a physical presence, a cold, heavy shroud. My home was a cage, and the monster was not outside, but walking freely within it. There was nowhere left to run. There was nowhere left to hide. And I knew, with a certainty that was the death of all hope, that my next encounter with the quiet technician would not be through a sound or an object. It would be face to face. The dawn that followed that terrible night did not bring relief. It brought a cold, stark clarity. I had spent the night on my couch, a rigid statue of fear, every nerve ending attuned to the silence from upstairs. But as the sun rose, casting long, intrusive fingers of light into my living room, the despair began to burn away, leaving behind the hard, sharp, and incandescent core of my rage. He had walked in my rooms. He had stood over my head, and I was still alive. The fear had not killed me, and now it was making me dangerous. He had made a critical mistake. Before, he had been a ghost, a presence in the walls, a creature of whispers in strange nests. His power was in his ambiguity, in his ability to make me question my own sanity. But the footstep, that single, solid, undeniable sound of a physical presence in my space, had changed everything. He was no longer a ghost. He was just a man who was hiding in my house. And a man could be found. A profound, fundamental shift occurred within me. The victim, the terrified woman who cowered on her couch, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone I didn't recognize. A huntress. My fear had not vanished, but it had been repurposed. It was no longer a paralyzing agent. It was a whetstone, sharpening my senses, focusing my will into a single pointed objective. I would not wait for him to come to me. I would go to him. I would find his den. My home, which had become my prison, was now my hunting ground. I was no longer interested in defending it with locks and cameras. I was now interested in dissecting it, in tearing it apart if necessary, to find his secret pathways. I would find where he came from. I would find how he moved. I would find his lair. And I would drag him out of the empty spaces and into the light. This was my house. And I was taking it back. My mission began with a new, methodical intensity. I was no longer looking for his leavings, his nests, or his gifts. I was looking for his infrastructure. I started in the basement, where I had found the locket. I spent hours tapping on the stone walls, searching for loose bricks, for hollow sounds, for any sign of a hidden entrance. I examined the dusty, forgotten corners with a forensic focus, searching for any sign of recent passage. From the basement, I moved to the ground floor. I pulled up the edges of old rugs. I checked behind bookcases. I inspected the dark, cavernous spaces under the stairs. I was seeing my house not as a home, but as a series of interconnected voids, a labyrinth of potential hiding places. The charming quirks of the Old Victorian, its nooks and crannies, were now all potential doorways for the monster I was hunting. My search was fueled by a cold, controlled fury. I was no longer afraid of the house's dark corners. I was attacking them, invading them, just as he had invaded my life. I was turning his own methods back on him. I was the one moving with a quiet, deliberate purpose now. I was the one becoming intimately familiar with the secret, forgotten spaces of the home. I was learning the geography of his world. My investigation became an obsession. I barely ate. I barely slept. My entire existence was consumed by the hunt. I bought a small, flexible endoscope camera, the kind plumbers use, and began feeding it into cracks in the floorboards and gaps in the walls, my phone screen showing me glimpses of the dark, dusty world he inhabited. I saw old pipes, thick cobwebs, and the ancient skeletal bones of the house. But I did not see him. He was silent during this time. The scratching had stopped. The footsteps had not returned. It was as if he knew I was hunting him, and he had retreated into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of his kingdom to wait me out. It was a silent battle of wills, a chess match being played in the dark. He was waiting for me to give up, to succumb to the exhaustion and the fear. But he had underestimated the power of my rage. I knew the answer had to be in the attic. It was the one place he had spent the most time during his initial assessment. It was a vast, hot, and largely unfinished space, a labyrinth of rafters and old insulation. It was the perfect place to build a hidden room, to create a secret door. It was the last great unexplored territory of my home. And I knew, with a certainty that was a cold fire in my gut, that I would find his heart up there, in the hot, dusty darkness. I pulled down the attic ladder with a screech of protesting metal. The air that descended was hot, thick, and smelled of ancient baked wood and fiberglass. I clipped a powerful work light to my belt, took a deep breath, and began to climb, my bare hands gripping the splintery wood of the ladder. I was ascending into the highest, hottest, and most secret part of my house, the place where I was sure his web was centered. The heat was oppressive, a stark contrast to the cold dread that filled me. The attic was a chaotic, cavernous space. The roof slanted down sharply, forcing me to crouch as I moved. Thick pink insulation was laid between the rafters on the floor, and the air was alive with dancing dust motes, illuminated by the beam of my light. It was a space of deep storage, filled with the forgotten relics of previous owners and the boxes of my own past that I had yet to face. It was a daunting, overwhelming landscape to search. But I was not deterred. I moved with a slow, methodical purpose, my light cutting through the gloom. I started in one corner and began my sweep. I was not just looking for a hole. I was looking for signs of recent activity, disturbed dust, footprints in the thick insulation, anything that indicated a recent, repeated passage. He had been quiet, but no man is completely without a trace. I would find the path he had worn in the dust. My search was painstaking. I spent hours in the suffocating heat, my clothes soaked with sweat, my lungs thick with dust. I moved old trunks. I peered behind ancient, discarded furniture. The attic was a maze, and I was determined to map its every corner. I was no longer afraid of the dark spaces. My rage had burned that fear away, leaving only a cold, hard, and patient determination. I would find him. I divided the attic into a grid, just as I would with a complex design project at work. I cleared each square, meter by meter, examining the walls, the floor, the rafters. I was looking for an inconsistency, a detail that was out of place. It was in the final quadrant, at the far end of the attic, behind a stack of old storm windows, that I found it. It was a section of the wall, a flat, unassuming piece of drywall between two studs. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but as I ran my hand over it, I felt it. A slight give, a looseness that was not present in the other sections of the wall. I pressed harder, and the panel moved, swinging inward with a soft, almost silent click. It was a hidden door, a panel on a magnetic latch, so perfectly integrated into the wall that it was nearly invisible. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. This was his door. Behind the panel was a dark, narrow void. The air that came from it was cool and carried a faint, unpleasant, musky scent. It was the smell of a small, unventilated space that had been lived in. It was the smell of him. I shone my light into the opening. It was a narrow, vertical crawl space, a hollow area that ran down between the walls of the house, one of the empty spaces he had told me about, the main artery of his hidden world. A part of me, the old, frightened part, screamed at me to turn back, to close the panel, to run from this house and never return. But the Huntress, the new, cold, and angry part of me, refused. I had come this far. I had found his lair. I could not turn back now. I had to see what was inside. I had to see the heart of his secret kingdom, the place where he had sat and listened to me, the place where he had carved my memories into a new, terrifying shape. I took the axe from my belt, its weight a familiar comfort. I checked the batteries on my flashlight. I was about to commit the final, ultimate trespass. I was not just entering his space anymore. I was entering his home, the secret home he had built within my own. I was the intruder now, the one who was about to violate the sanctity of a private space. The irony was a cold, bitter taste in my mouth. With my axe held ready, I squeezed my body through the narrow opening. I was leaving the known world of my house, the world of attics and basements, and I was entering the void. I was stepping into the empty spaces, into the darkness between the walls. I was going into his world, a world he had built for himself, a world he had never intended for me to see. And I had no idea what I was about to find. The space behind the panel was not a crawl space. It was a room. A narrow, cramped, and coffin-like room that had been carved out of the large, unused void between the attic and the second-floor bedrooms. The walls were the raw, exposed lath and plaster of the house's original construction. A single bare wire ran from the ceiling, terminating in a low-wattage bulb that cast a weak, sickly yellow glow over the scene. This was his home. This was the heart of the house's sickness. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the dry, chalky scent of plaster dust. It was a smell of secret, squalid living. In one corner, there was a makeshift bed, a pile of old, filthy blankets and sleeping bags arranged on top of a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. Next to it was a small collection of empty water bottles and the wrappers from dozens of protein bars. He had been living here for a long time. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the details of his hidden life. He had created a world for himself in the hollow spaces. The walls were lined with makeshift shelves, constructed from old planks of wood, and on these shelves were his things. But they were not normal things. They were his nests. There were at least a dozen of them, each one unique, each one woven with the same obsessive, meticulous care. Some were small, like the one I had found in the closet. Others were larger, more complex, incorporating new materials. I saw one woven, with strips of my own discarded mail, my name and address visible in the dim light. Another used the bright, colorful plastic from grocery bags. It was a gallery of his work, a museum of his madness, built from the trash and detritus of my own life. He was a parasite, and this was his nest. I moved deeper into the cramped space, my senses overwhelmed. My initial rage was being replaced by a profound, chilling sense of awe at the sheer scale of his obsession. This was not a man who was simply hiding. This was a man who was building a new reality for himself, a world that was a twisted, funhouse mirror reflection of my own. He was not just living in my house. He was absorbing it, metabolizing it, turning its very substance into his own strange art. And then I saw his workbench. It was a small, overturned crate in the center of the room, and on it were his tools. A set of small, precise-looking carving knives, a piece of sandpaper, and several small blocks of soft pine wood. This was where he worked. This was where he had carved the doll. This was the source of the slow, patient, nightly scratching sound that had so terrified me. It was the sound of his creation, of his art. Next to the workbench was another collection. It was not a collection of nests, but of his finished pieces. My heart pounded as I shone my light on them. There was a small, perfectly carved replica of my favorite armchair from the living room. There was a miniature version of the antique teapot I kept on my stove. There was a tiny, intricate carving of my own car, perfect down to the small scratch on the driver's side door. He had been watching me with a level of detail that was almost godlike. He had not just observed my home, he had memorized it, had studied my possessions, my furniture, my life, with the intense, focused eye of a master artist. And then, in the silence and the darkness of his secret room, he had painstakingly recreated my world in miniature. It was an act of worship, of possession, of profound, terrifying intimacy. I was not just a person to him. I was a subject of intense, academic study. He was not just a stalker. He was an archivist, a curator of my life. He was building a dollhouse version of my world, and I was the unwitting doll living within it. The thought made me feel dizzy, unreal. My life, my home, my very existence, had been reduced to a set of objects to be replicated by a madman in a hidden room. I felt a surge of nausea and backed away from the workbench, from the tiny, perfect replicas of my life. This revelation was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The threat was not that he wanted to harm me or steal from me. The threat was that he wanted to be me, or to possess me in this strange, symbolic, and utterly complete way. I had to get out. I had to get out of his room, out of his world. As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught one last detail, something I had missed before. Tacked to the wall above his makeshift bed was a single faded photograph. It was a picture of a young family, a man, a woman, and a small child, standing in front of my house. The photo was old, from the 1980s perhaps, the colors washed out with age. The man in the photograph was a younger, happier version of the quiet technician. It was his family, and this had been his childhood home. The revelation was a final, devastating blow. He wasn't just an intruder, he was a ghost, a living ghost, haunting the home he had lost, a place that was now filled with my life, my things. He was not trying to build a replica of my world. He was trying to rebuild his own, using my life as the scaffolding, my armchair, my teapot, my car. They were just stand-ins for the things his family had once owned, the things that had once filled these rooms. I finally understood the doll. It was not a copy of my grandmother's doll. My doll had been a copy of his. His mother had likely owned one just like it, passed down through his own family. He had seen mine in the attic and had not replicated it, but had likely seen it as an echo of his own, a proof of my unworthiness to live in his sacred space. The violation was deeper than I could have ever imagined. I was a usurper in his family's tomb. I backed out of the secret room, my mind a storm of pity and terror. He was a man so broken by loss that he had literally retreated into the walls of his own past, unable to move on. This knowledge did not make him less frightening. It made him more so. He was not just a madman. He was a man with a purpose, a righteous, delusional purpose. He was the keeper of this house's memory, and I was the intruder he was trying to exorcise. I sealed the panel behind me, my hands shaking. My plan to confront him, to fight him, now seemed utterly foolish. How do you fight a man who is not living? In your reality? How do you reason with a ghost? I knew then that I could not handle this on my own. My rage was gone, replaced by a cold, practical fear. I had the proof I needed. I had found his lair. Now I had to bring in the outside world. I climbed down from the attic, my body covered in a fine layer of dust and a cold sweat. I went to my phone, my fingers steady now with a new, clear purpose. I was not going to be the Huntress. I was going to be the witness. I would call the police. I would tell them I had found evidence of a man living in my walls. I would show them the room. I would let them handle the ghost. But I had to be smart. He was still in here, somewhere, in the empty spaces. If I called the police now, he would hear me. He would flee, disappearing back into his secret pathways before they could ever arrive. I would be left with an unbelievable story and a hidden room that he would never return to, leaving me to wonder forever if he was truly gone. I had to be sure they would catch him. So I formulated a new plan, a final plan. I would wait for the night. I would wait for him to become active again, for the scratching to start. And when I was sure he was in his workshop, in his secret room. I would make the call. I would trap him in his own lair. I would use his own routine, his own predictability, against him one last time. The house was quiet for the rest of the day, but it was a different kind of quiet now. I was no longer just afraid of what was in the walls. I knew what was in the walls. I knew his story. I knew his pain. And that knowledge was a heavy, sorrowful burden. I was about to destroy the last, pathetic remnant of a life that had been shattered long before I ever moved into this house. But my pity could not outweigh my terror. He was a man, yes, a broken man. But he was also an intruder, a presence that had violated my life in the most profound way imaginable. My home had to be my own again. I sat in my living room, the phone in my hand, and I waited for the night to fall. I waited for the sound of the quiet technician to begin his work, for the final terrible confrontation to begin. The wait for nightfall was the longest of my life. I sat in my silent house, a ghost in my own living room, every nerve ending alive with a mixture of terror and grim resolve. My plan was simple, but its execution depended entirely on him, on the predictability of his madness. I had to wait for him to return to his workshop, to the secret room in my attic, before I could make my move. The house was a giant trap, and I was the willing, terrified bait. As darkness consumed the house, I turned off all the lights, wanting the house to appear as it always did when he began his work. Quiet, dark, and asleep. I sat on the stairs leading to the second floor, my phone clutched in my hand, my body tense. I was listening. I was waiting for the familiar, slow, scraping sound to begin. The sound of his nightly ritual. The sound of his art. It was the signal I was waiting for. At just after 1 a.m, it began. A faint, dry scratching coming from the ceiling above the second floor. From the attic. From his room. He was there. He was working. A wave of cold relief washed over me, immediately followed by a surge of adrenaline. The trap was set. The prey was inside. I slowly, silently, crept back down the stairs to the kitchen, as far away as I could get while still being able to make the call. I dialed 911, my thumb trembling over the screen. When the dispatcher answered, I kept my voice to a low, urgent whisper. "There is someone in my house," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "He is not in the main rooms. He is inside the walls, in my attic. I have found where he is hiding. You have to be quiet. If he hears you, he will disappear." I knew how insane I sounded, but I didn't care anymore. The dispatcher was silent for a moment, and I could hear the skepticism in that silence. "Ma'am, can you repeat that? You say someone is inside your walls?" I repeated my story, my voice firm, insisting that I was not crazy, that I had found a hidden room, and that the intruder was there right now. I gave her my address. To her credit, after a moment's hesitation, she said that she was dispatching officers to my location. The wait for the police was the most terrifying part of the ordeal. I was huddled in my dark kitchen, listening to two sounds at once: the distant promise of sirens and the faint, steady scratching from the attic. He was still up there, working on his terrible miniature creations, completely unaware that the outside world was about to come crashing into his secret, squalid kingdom. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Finally, I saw the flashing blue and red lights painting the houses across the street, They came without sirens, respecting my whispered request for silence. I watched through the window as 2 officers got out of their cruiser, their movements cautious. I unlocked my front door and met them on the porch, my finger to my lips. I explained the situation again in a frantic, hushed whisper, my story of the quiet technician, the nests, and the hidden room. They looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and professional caution. I could see they thought I was mentally unstable, but the possibility of a home invasion, however strange, meant they had to follow procedure. "Ma'am, I need you to wait out here," the first officer said, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Let us clear the house first." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood on my own front lawn, shivering in the cold night air, and watched as the 2 officers entered my home. I saw their flashlight beams cutting through the dark windows as they moved from room to room. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience, watching armed strangers sweep through my own house, hunting for a man who lived in the walls, a man whose existence they didn't truly believe in. I prayed they would find the panel. After what felt like an eternity. The first officer came back to the door and beckoned me inside. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now devoid of any skepticism, replaced by a tone of pure, unadulterated shock. "You need to show us what you found in the attic." I led them up the stairs, my own fear now mixed with a strange, vindicating sense of triumph. They believed me. They had to. They had seen the house was empty. Now they would see his world. Led them up the pull-down ladder and into the hot, stuffy darkness of the attic. I pointed my trembling flashlight beam towards the far wall, towards the innocuous-looking panel behind the old storm windows. "There," I whispered. "He's in there. I can hear him." The scratching had stopped the moment the officers had entered. The house. He knew. The silence from within the wall was now a heavy, knowing silence. The 2 officers approached the wall cautiously, their weapons drawn. One of them pressed his ear against the drywall, listening. He looked back at his partner and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had heard something, a breath, a rustle. I felt a wave of pure, terrifying validation. The officer knocked on the panel. "This is the police," he said, his voice booming in the enclosed space. "Come out with your hands up." The only answer was silence. After another warning, they took action. One officer used the heavy heel of his boot to kick the panel in. It burst open with a crash of splintering wood and plaster dust, revealing the dark, cramped, and foul-smelling room within. They shone their powerful flashlights into the space. I could see the nests, the workbench, the pathetic, squalid details of his hidden life, but the room was empty. He was gone, but he couldn't be. There was no other exit. As the officers cautiously stepped into the space, one of them noticed a disturbance on the far wall, a section of the exposed lathe that was broken, leading into the even deeper darkness of the house's main structural void. He had a bolt hole within his bolt hole. He had slipped away into the deepest, most inaccessible arteries of the house the moment he knew he was discovered. He was a rat, and he knew all the secret paths. A full-scale search was launched. More officers arrived. They spent hours trying to track him through the walls, their muffled shouts and the sound of them tearing into drywall echoing through the house. But it was useless. He was gone. He had vanished, leaving behind only the bizarre, heartbreaking evidence of his long, secret tenancy. The nests, the carvings, the photograph of his lost family. He had left his entire world behind. I never spent another night in that house. The police declared it an active crime scene, but I knew I could never go back regardless. The house was no longer my home. It was a hollowed-out thing, its walls a honeycomb of secret passages and sad, terrible memories. I sold it at a massive loss to a developer who, I later learned, tore it down to build 2 modern, characterless duplexes. They bulldozed the empty spaces, erasing his world completely. I live in one of those new builds now, ironically. A clean, modern apartment with thin walls and no history. There are no attics, no basements, no secret voids or forgotten closets. Every square inch of the space is accounted for. It is a sterile, boring, and blessedly solid place. I have tried to build a new life for myself, one based on simplicity, transparency, and a complete lack of hidden spaces. The quiet technician, the man whose name I never even learned, was never found. He became a local legend, a ghost story whispered by the officers who had been there that night. The man in the wall. They found his name from Old Town records, confirmed he had grown up in the house, but he had no current address, no living relatives. He had simply disappeared back into the world, a quiet, unassuming phantom. I have convinced myself that it is over. His obsession was with the house, with the physical container of his memories. The house is gone. Therefore, his reason for haunting my life should be gone too. He has no reason to find me. I am just a footnote in his long, sad story, the woman who happened to buy his tomb. I live a quiet life now, and for 2 years, that life has been peaceful. But this morning, I was cleaning out the back of my own modern, characterless closet, and I found something. Tucked away in the far back corner, behind a stack of shoeboxes, was a small, perfectly constructed object. It was a tiny nest, woven with a meticulous, almost artistic precision. It was made from my own carpet fibers, strands of my own hair, and tiny, shredded scraps of paper from a magazine I had thrown out last week.